The girl appeared in the snow like a question no man on the frontier expected to answer. Ethan Caldwell noticed her just before dawn, when the cold Wyoming wind pushed thin lines of powder across the frozen ground, and the sky held that pale blue color that comes a few minutes before sunrise. He had stepped out of his barn to check on a restless horse when he saw a shape near the fence line about 30 yards away, half hidden beneath a drift of wind-blown snow. At first he thought it was nothing more than a fallen saddle blanket or some stray bundle left by a traveler passing through the valley. But then the shape moved, barely, just enough to catch the corner of his eye. Ethan walked slowly across the yard, his boots pressing quiet tracks into the frozen dirt, the leather of his coat creaking softly with each step. The air smelled like cedar smoke from last night's fire, and the sharp, clean bite of winter coming down from the mountains. When he reached the fence, he saw her clearly. A young native girl lay curled beside the post, as if she had simply run out of strength before reaching the barn door. Her dark hair was tangled with snow, and her thin coat looked far too light for a night that had dropped below 15 degrees. One hand still clutched something small and metal that glinted faintly in the early light. Ethan knelt beside her and brushed away the snow from her shoulder. She was breathing, slow but steady. Her face carried the quiet stillness of someone who had traveled a long way alone. For a moment Ethan just watched her, listening to the wind slide through the wooden rails of the fence and the distant sound of cattle shifting in the pasture. Out here a man learned that trouble rarely arrived with warning, and strangers often carried stories that were better left unopened. But leaving her there in the cold wasn't something he could do either. Carefully, he lifted the small object from her hand. It was a knife, but not the kind cowboys carried for cutting rope or trimming leather. The blade was short, balanced, and the handle held a piece of turquoise set into carved bone. Ethan had seen knives like that before during trading seasons along the Redstone trails. They belonged to Apache warriors, not wandering girls lost in the snow. The thought settled quietly in his mind as the wind pushed another thin wave of frost across the valley. He glanced toward the low hills that surrounded his ranch, half expecting to see riders watching from the ridges, but the land stayed empty and silent under the pale morning sky. The girl stirred slightly when he picked her up, her fingers tightening weakly against his coat, as if she was holding on to the last piece of warmth she could find. She weighed almost nothing. Ethan carried her toward the barn, the wooden doors groaning open as he stepped inside, where the air smelled of hay, leather, and horses. A lantern hung from a beam above, casting a soft amber glow across the stalls. As he laid her down on a folded blanket near the tack wall, he noticed something else beneath the edge of her sleeve. A small mark, faint but unmistakable, inked just above her wrist. Ethan had seen that symbol once before, years ago, carved into a stone marker along an Apache trail. It wasn't the mark of an ordinary tribe member. It was the mark of a chief's bloodline. Ethan Caldwell didn't know the girl's name. He didn't know where she came from or why she had collapsed outside his ranch in the middle of a Wyoming winter. But one thing was already clear in the quiet lantern light of that barn. The girl sleeping on his blanket was not a homeless wanderer. And before long, the truth about her was going to reach this valley. Morning came slowly across Ethan Caldwell's ranch, the kind of cold Wyoming morning where the sun rose pale and quiet over miles of frozen grass. Inside the barn the lantern still burned low, its soft light mixing with the thin blue glow slipping through the wooden slats of the walls. The horses shifted gently in their stalls, the sound of hooves pressing into straw echoing in the calm air. Ethan stood near the small iron stove he had dragged from the house during the night, feeding it another piece of cedar while the warmth spread slowly through the room. The girl still slept beneath the heavy ranch blanket, her breathing steady now, though her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had traveled farther than most people her age ever would. When she finally stirred, it happened slowly. Her fingers tightened against the rough wool of the blanket, and her eyes opened with the alert stillness of someone used to waking in unfamiliar places. She did not panic. She did not speak at first. Instead, she watched the room, the door, the stalls, and then the man standing a few steps away beside the stove. Ethan noticed that look immediately. It was the look of someone measuring distance, exits, and silence all at once. Most people woke with confusion. This girl woke like someone who had learned to survive long before she reached his barn. Ethan poured warm water into a tin cup and stepped closer, careful not to move too fast. The leather floorboards creaked under his boots, and the horses snorted softly behind him. When he offered the cup, she hesitated for only a moment before taking it. Her hands trembled slightly from the cold, but her grip was steady. Up close, Ethan could see more clearly now. She could not have been older than 17. The snow had washed most of the dust from her face, revealing sharp eyes the color of dark earth after rain. The coat she wore had once been good leather, but it had been repaired many times with careful stitching that looked almost ceremonial. Around her neck hung the same turquoise pendant he had noticed earlier, the stone catching a quiet beam of morning light slipping through the barn wall. She drank slowly, then looked up at him with the calm focus of someone who had already decided something important. "My name is Lena," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan nodded once. "Ethan Caldwell. This is my ranch." The girl glanced toward the barn doors where sunlight now stretched across the straw floor. For a moment it seemed like she might say more, but the words stayed behind her eyes. Ethan had lived alone long enough to recognize silence when it carried weight. He did not ask where she came from. Instead, he handed her a piece of warm bread from the small cloth bundle he had brought from the house. She accepted it politely, though she ate like someone who had not seen a proper meal in days. While she ate, Ethan noticed something else. The way she held the knife he had placed beside the blanket. She did not clutch it nervously like a frightened traveler. She held it balanced in her palm, turning it once with the quiet familiarity of someone trained to carry it. Outside the barn, a gust of wind pushed across the valley, rattling the fence posts and sending a thin wave of snow sliding across the ground. The morning sun climbed slowly higher, painting the open land gold and silver beyond the doors. Lena followed the sound of the wind and stood carefully, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She walked to the open doorway and looked out across the wide Wyoming plains as if she were searching for something far beyond the horizon. Ethan watched her from the stove, noticing the straight posture in her shoulders and the quiet confidence in the way she moved despite the long journey she must have taken. For someone who claimed to be homeless, she carried herself like a person who had once belonged somewhere important. And as the cold wind swept across the ranch again, Ethan began to realize that whatever story Lena had told him was only the smallest piece of the truth. The third day after the girl arrived, the valley began to notice something had changed at Ethan Caldwell's ranch. Word traveled slowly across the Wyoming plains, usually carried by wagon wheels, trading routes, or the quiet conversations that passed between ranchers during supply runs. That morning, Ethan rode the 5 miles into Redstone Crossing to pick up flour, lamp oil, and a new horseshoe for the gray mare in his north pasture. The small frontier town was already awake when he arrived, its wooden boardwalks creaking beneath the boots of miners, traders, and farmers moving through the cold air. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimneys of the general store and the blacksmith shed, carrying the scent of coal and fresh pine into the pale winter sunlight. Ethan tied his horse outside the trading post and stepped inside where the warmth of the stove wrapped around him like a familiar coat. A few men glanced up from their coffee cups when he entered, their quiet conversation slowing just long enough to mark his arrival. Ethan Caldwell was not a man who visited town often, and when someone like that appeared, people noticed. He collected his supplies without hurry, exchanging a short nod with the store owner before stepping back onto the boardwalk with a sack of flour slung over his shoulder. He had just finished tying the bundle behind his saddle when a voice stopped him. "Ethan." Sheriff Marcus Doyle leaned against the wooden post beside the saloon, his hat tipped low against the bright sun. The sheriff was a broad man with sharp eyes that rarely missed much in a town this small. Ethan walked his horse closer, the animal's breath rising in pale clouds as it shifted beside him. "Sheriff." Doyle studied him for a moment, then glanced toward the wide valley stretching beyond the town. "Heard something curious this morning," Doyle said slowly. "Word is you picked up a traveler out near your ranch." Ethan rested one hand on the saddle horn. "Someone needed shelter. That is all." Doyle's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing something unseen. The traveler would not happen to be a native girl, would she? The question settled between them like dust in still air. A few men nearby had stopped talking altogether, their attention drifting quietly toward the two figures standing beside the hitching rail. Ethan answered simply, "Her name is Lena." She was freezing. I gave her a place to rest. The sheriff pushed himself away from the post and stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Ethan could hear. Apache do not wander alone out here, Caldwell. If one shows up on your land, there is usually a reason. Ethan did not reply immediately. Instead, he watched a wagon roll slowly past the edge of town, its wheels crunching across the frozen dirt road. Doyle continued, his tone steady but firm. Just keep your eyes open. Trouble on the frontier rarely knocks before it arrives. Ethan nodded once and mounted his horse, turning the animal toward the open trail that led back to his ranch. The ride home took nearly an hour, the winter sun climbing higher above the wide plains as the wind carried thin ribbons of snow across the grasslands. When the barn finally came into view in the distance, Ethan slowed the horse to a quiet walk. Lena stood near the corral fence with one of the younger horses, her hand resting gently along the animal's neck as if she had known it for years. The horse did not shy away from her touch. It stood calm and steady beside her. Ethan watched from the saddle for a moment before dismounting. For someone who claimed to have nowhere to go, the girl moved across his ranch with the quiet certainty of someone who understood land, animals, and silence better than most people who had lived in Wyoming their entire lives. And as the afternoon wind swept across the valley again, Ethan began to realize that the sheriff's warning might not have been about danger arriving at his ranch. It might have been about the secret already standing beside his fence. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm across Ethan Caldwell's ranch, the kind of rhythm that came from simple work and wide open land. Winter still held the valley in a steady grip, but the sun climbed a little higher each afternoon, casting long bands of light across the pale grasslands that stretched for miles in every direction. Ethan spent his mornings repairing fence posts along the north pasture, the steady knock of his hammer echoing across the open range while the cold wind carried the scent of dry sage and distant pine. Lena moved through the ranch with a calm presence that slowly became part of that rhythm. She helped with small chores without needing to be asked, carrying water from the well, brushing the horses, and stacking firewood beside the barn door before nightfall. She spoke little, but she watched everything. Ethan noticed the way her eyes followed the sky at sunrise, the way she paused when the wind shifted direction, and the quiet way she studied the ridge lines that bordered the valley as if those distant hills held answers to questions she had not spoken aloud. One afternoon, Ethan returned from checking the western fence line and found her standing near the corral gate with the young chestnut horse again. The animal had once been restless around strangers, but it stood beside Lena now with its head lowered, breathing calmly while her hand rested along its neck. Ethan leaned against the fence rail, observing quietly. Most people needed weeks before a new horse trusted them that easily. Lena had earned that trust in only a few days. When she noticed him watching, she stepped back from the horse and brushed a strand of dark hair from her face. The wind carried a faint sound across the valley then, something distant and almost lost beneath the rustling grass. Ethan turned his head toward the northern ridge. At first he saw nothing but the familiar line of hills cutting across the horizon. Then he noticed it. A single hawk circling high above the ridge, its wide wings catching the sunlight as it glided slowly over the land. The bird drifted in a slow circle before rising again into the pale winter sky. Lena followed the movement of the hawk with careful attention, her expression tightening slightly in a way Ethan had not seen before. "You expecting someone?" Ethan asked quietly. She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked out across the plains where the wind pushed thin trails of snow across the frozen ground like drifting smoke. Finally, she shook her head gently. "Just watching the land," she said. Ethan accepted the answer, but the silence that followed carried a weight he could not ignore. Later that evening, the sky darkened early as clouds rolled over the mountains to the west. Ethan lit the lanterns inside the barn while the horses settled into their stalls for the night. The smell of hay and warm leather filled the air, while the steady crackle of firewood from the small stove spread heat through the room. Lena sat quietly near the doorway, her turquoise pendant catching the lantern light as it moved gently with her breathing. Outside the barn, the wind shifted again, colder now, carrying a faint rustle from the distant hills. Ethan stepped to the doorway and scanned the dark horizon, his eyes moving slowly across the quiet valley. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then he noticed something unusual along the northern ridge. Far away against the fading light, several small shapes moved along the crest of the hill, barely visible but unmistakable to someone who had spent years reading the land. Riders. They were too distant to count clearly, their figures blending into the twilight as they paused along the ridge line overlooking the valley below. Ethan felt the quiet awareness that always came before change on the frontier. When he turned back toward the barn, Lena was already standing beside the open doorway, her eyes fixed on the same distant ridge as if she had been expecting that moment all along. The riders remained on the ridge long after the sun disappeared behind the mountains. From the doorway of the barn, Ethan Caldwell watched the distant silhouettes against the fading sky while the wind moved slowly across the valley floor. The figures were too far away to recognize clearly, but their presence carried a quiet weight that settled into the evening air. They did not approach. They did not signal. They simply waited along the ridge as if the land itself had called them there. Inside the barn, the lantern flame flickered gently while the horses shifted in their stalls, their steady breathing filling the warm space with a calm rhythm. Lena stood beside the doorway with her eyes fixed on the same ridge line. The soft lantern light reflected from the turquoise pendant resting against her collarbone, the stone glowing faintly each time the flame moved. Ethan noticed something different in her posture now. She was not frightened. She was not surprised. Instead, she looked toward the riders with the quiet recognition of someone who had been expecting that moment to arrive. Ethan stepped outside onto the frozen ground, the cold air settling into his coat while the night sky deepened above the valley. From the open plains came only the distant whistle of wind sliding through the grass and the faint creak of the barn doors behind him. After several minutes, the shapes on the ridge began to move again. One by one, the riders turned their horses away from the valley and disappeared beyond the hill as silently as they had appeared. Within moments, the ridge was empty once more. Ethan remained standing in the dark for a while longer, studying the quiet land where the riders had been. When he finally stepped back inside the barn, Lena had moved closer to the lantern, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the wooden table beside the stove. "They were not coming tonight," she said quietly. Ethan rested his gloves beside the lantern and looked at her. "You know who they are." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted the turquoise pendant from her chest and studied it for a moment as if the stone carried a memory older than the valley itself. "My people watch the land before they walk on it," she said after a moment. "They listen to the wind first." Ethan considered those words carefully. The riders were Apache then. Lena lowered the pendant and met his eyes. Yes. The simple answer hung in the warm air between them. Ethan nodded slowly and added another piece of wood to the stove. The fire brightened, casting a soft glow across the barn walls while the quiet night deepened outside. After a while, Lena spoke again, her voice softer now. "They will come soon. Not to fight. To find me." Ethan did not seem surprised by the statement. He had lived long enough on the frontier to understand that every traveler carried a story that eventually caught up with them. He leaned against the stall rail and watched the horses settle down for the night. Then he looked back at Lena. "You planning to leave when they arrive?" Lena turned toward the open doorway where the cold Wyoming stars now filled the sky beyond the dark valley. For a moment, she seemed much older than the young traveler who had collapsed beside his fence only days before. "I was planning to keep running," she said quietly. "But now I am not so sure." Outside the barn, the wind shifted again, moving across the wide plains toward the distant hills where the riders had disappeared. Somewhere far away, a hawk cried once in the darkness before the valley returned to silence. Ethan stood beside the lantern and listened to the quiet land around his ranch, knowing that whatever story Lena carried had not ended when she reached his door. It had only paused, and somewhere beyond the northern ridge, the people searching for her were already preparing to cross the valley. Morning arrived slowly across the valley, pale light stretching over the frozen plains while the Wyoming wind carried long whispers through the dry grass. Ethan Caldwell stepped out of his cabin just after sunrise, the wooden porch creaking beneath his boots as he studied the open land surrounding his ranch. The sky was clear and wide, the kind of morning that made the mountains appear closer than they truly were. Smoke from the stovepipe drifted gently behind him, and somewhere in the barn a horse stamped softly against the straw floor. For a moment, the valley looked exactly as it always had, quiet and empty, the long miles of open land resting beneath the winter sky. Then Ethan noticed the movement. At first it appeared only as small shadows along the northern ridge where the hills rose like a dark line against the horizon. But as the sun climbed higher, those shadows sharpened into shapes that no rancher could mistake. Riders. Many of them. They moved slowly along the crest of the ridge, their horses stepping carefully across the frozen ground while the morning light revealed the quiet strength of the group. Ethan did not count them out loud, but his eyes followed their line across the ridge until he understood the size of what he was seeing. It was not a hunting party. It was not a handful of travelers crossing the plains. It was a formation of riders moving together with purpose. From the barn doorway, Lena appeared beside him, the turquoise pendant resting against her coat as the wind lifted strands of her dark hair. She had already seen them. Her gaze remained fixed on the ridge while the riders continued their slow approach along the high ground overlooking the valley. They found the trail, she said quietly. Ethan folded his arms against the cold and studied the distant figures again. The riders had not descended into the valley yet. They remained on the ridge, their silhouettes forming a silent line against the morning sky as if they were studying the ranch below. No one rushed forward. No one called out. The land itself seemed to pause with them. Ethan turned slightly toward Lena. Your people move carefully. Lena nodded once. They always watch before they speak. For several long minutes the riders stayed where they were, the horses shifting gently beneath them while the winter wind rolled across the plains. Then one rider moved forward from the center of the group. The figure rode a tall, dark horse that stepped confidently down the slope from the ridge toward the valley floor. The rest of the riders remained behind, forming a still line along the crest while the single rider approached the open land leading toward Ethan's ranch. The distance between them slowly closed, the steady rhythm of hooves carrying across the frozen grass. Ethan stood beside the porch rail watching the rider approach without reaching for a weapon or turning away. The frontier had taught him that some meetings were decided long before the first words were spoken. When the rider finally reached the lower valley, the morning sun revealed more detail. The horse carried traditional tack decorated with small beads and leather patterns that caught the light. The rider sat tall and calm in the saddle, wrapped in a heavy coat that moved gently with the wind. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the quiet authority in the way the rider held the reins. Lena stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the open yard, her boots pressing soft prints into the frozen ground. Ethan watched her carefully as she stopped near the corral fence and faced the approaching rider. Her shoulders were straight now, her posture steady in a way that looked nothing like the exhausted traveler he had carried into the barn days before. The rider brought the horse to a halt about 30 yards from the ranch house. For a moment neither side spoke. The valley remained silent except for the wind moving across the plains and the distant shifting of horses along the ridge behind him. Then the rider removed his hat and inclined his head slightly toward Lena. And in that quiet gesture, Ethan Caldwell realized that the people on the ridge had not come searching for a lost traveler. They had come to escort someone home. The rider remained still in the saddle, the dark horse breathing softly beneath him while the winter wind carried slow currents of cold air across the valley floor. Ethan Caldwell stood near the porch rail watching the quiet meeting unfold, his eyes shifting between the lone rider and the long line of figures still waiting along the northern ridge. From this distance, he could see the riders clearly now, dozens of them stretching across the hilltop like silent guardians of the land. None of them moved forward. None of them raised a weapon or called out. They simply waited. Lena walked several steps farther into the yard until she stood halfway between the ranch house and the approaching rider. Her coat moved gently in the wind while the turquoise pendant rested against her chest, glinting softly in the morning sun. The rider studied her for a long moment, then dismounted slowly from his horse. His boots touched the frozen ground with calm confidence, and he placed one hand lightly against the saddle as if greeting an old friend before turning fully toward her. Up close the man appeared older than Ethan had first expected. His hair carried streaks of gray, and his face held the deep lines of someone who had spent many seasons beneath open skies. Yet there was strength in the way he stood, the kind of steady presence that did not need to announce itself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried easily across the open yard. "You traveled far," he said to Lena. His English was careful but clear. Lena nodded once, her eyes steady. "Far enough." The man inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried respect rather than command. The valley has been searching for you. Lena lowered her gaze briefly toward the ground, and for the first time since Ethan had met her, she seemed unsure of her next words. I needed time, she answered quietly. The rider studied her expression, then glanced toward the ranch house, where Ethan still stood watching. His eyes moved calmly across the barn, the corral, and the open pasture beyond, as if he were memorizing the land that had sheltered her. Finally, he looked back at Lena. You were safe here. It was not a question. Lena turned slightly toward Ethan and the ranch behind him. Yes, she said softly. Very safe. The rider nodded again, then placed his hand over his heart in a gesture Ethan had never seen before, but somehow understood immediately. He turned toward the porch where Ethan stood and spoke with quiet respect. You gave shelter when the wind was cold. Ethan stepped forward a few paces into the yard, the crunch of frozen grass beneath his boots breaking the long silence between them. Anyone would have done the same, he replied calmly. The rider's expression carried the faintest hint of a smile. Not everyone would. Behind him, the line of riders along the ridge remained motionless beneath the bright winter sky, their presence forming a silent promise that this moment held meaning far beyond a simple meeting on a ranch. Lena took one slow breath and lifted the turquoise pendant from her chest, holding it briefly in her hand before letting it fall again against her coat. She turned fully toward Ethan then, and something in her posture had changed. The hesitation of a wandering traveler had vanished. In its place stood someone who carried the quiet certainty of belonging somewhere much larger than this valley. My name is not Lena, she said at last. The wind moved across the yard, lifting dust from the frozen earth as Ethan listened. My name is Ayanna Red Hawk. The words settled into the open air, like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan glanced toward the ridge where the waiting riders remained perfectly aligned along the hill. A name like that was not easily mistaken on the frontier. Ayanna continued gently, her voice steady now. The man who came for me is my uncle. He serves my father. Ethan looked back at the rider standing calmly beside his horse. And your father? Ayanna's eyes moved toward the distant line of warriors watching from the ridge. My father leads them. The wind moved slowly across Ethan Caldwell's ranch while the name Ayanna Red Hawk settled into the quiet morning air. For a long moment no one spoke. The horses in the corral shifted gently, their breath rising in pale clouds while the winter sun climbed higher above the wide Wyoming plains. Ethan looked from Ayanna to the rider beside his horse, and then toward the distant ridge where the rest of the warriors waited in perfect stillness. The scene carried a calm weight that felt larger than the ranch itself, as if the land had paused to witness what was happening. Ayanna stood with quiet dignity now, her shoulders straight and her eyes steady in a way Ethan had not seen during the days she had spent under his roof. The tired traveler who had collapsed beside his fence had disappeared. In her place stood the daughter of a leader. The man beside the horse stepped forward slowly, his boots pressing lightly into the frozen ground. When he spoke again, his voice carried both gratitude and authority. Ayanna Red Hawk is the daughter of Chief Red Hawk, he said, turning slightly, so his words reached Ethan clearly. Our people searched the valleys and rivers for many days when she did not return. The wind lifted a strand of Ayanna's hair as she listened quietly beside them. Ethan rested one hand on the corral fence, absorbing the meaning behind those words. A chief's daughter wandering alone across the frontier was not a small matter. The rider continued calmly. She left her people without telling anyone. She wished to walk the land alone and understand the world beyond our valley. Ayanna lowered her eyes slightly, though there was no shame in her expression, only reflection. My father teaches that a leader must know the land beyond his own fire, she said softly. I wanted to see the towns, the ranches, the places where our people and your people meet. Ethan studied her for a moment. And you found trouble along the way. Ayanna shook her head gently. I found the wind, the snow, and the truth that the land is larger than one tribe or one town. She glanced toward the ridge where the warriors still waited beneath the winter sky. When the storms came, I kept walking until I reached this valley. The rider nodded once. And this man gave you shelter. His gaze moved respectfully toward Ethan again. Among our people we remember such things. Ethan shifted his weight slightly against the fence rail, uncomfortable with the attention but calm as always. She needed a warm place. That is all there was to it. The rider's eyes softened slightly, as if he understood more than Ethan wished to say. Kindness on the frontier is never small, he replied quietly. Ayanna stepped closer to Ethan then, her boots pressing softly into the frozen ground. The turquoise pendant moved gently as she spoke. I did not tell you my real name because I wanted to know how the world treats a stranger with no name. She looked across the ranch one last time, her eyes moving over the barn, the horses, and the open land beyond the fences. But you treated me the same way you would treat anyone who needed help. Ethan gave a small shrug. The land out here is hard enough without turning away people who need a fire and a roof. The wind carried that simple sentence across the yard. On the distant ridge, several of the waiting warriors shifted their horses slightly, as if the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. The rider beside them placed his hat back on his head and gestured toward the hills where the rest of the Apache riders waited. It is time for Ayanna to return to her father, he said gently. The valley has waited long enough for her footsteps to come home. The valley remained quiet after the rider finished speaking, the winter wind drifting slowly across Ethan Caldwell's ranch, while the distant line of Apache warriors waited along the ridge like silent figures carved from the land itself. For a long moment no one moved. Ayanna Red Hawk stood beside the corral fence, her turquoise pendant catching the morning light while she looked across the familiar shapes of the barn, the pasture, and the long stretch of open plains beyond the ranch. Only a few days earlier she had arrived here with nothing but cold wind at her back and snow on her shoulders. Now the valley felt different, as if the land itself had become part of her story. Ethan rested both hands on the top rail of the fence, watching the quiet exchange with the calm patience that had guided him through many seasons on the frontier. Finally Ayanna stepped closer to him, the frozen grass crunching softly beneath her boots. I did not plan to stay this long, she said gently. The wind lifted a few strands of her dark hair, while the distant riders remained still on the ridge. Ethan gave a small nod. The frontier rarely follows the plans people make. A faint smile touched Ayanna's face at that. She looked toward the barn where the horses shifted lazily inside the warm shelter. Those horses trusted me before they knew who I was, she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze. Horses understand people better than most towns do. The rider who had come for her waited respectfully beside his horse, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. After a moment Ayanna reached up and removed the turquoise pendant from around her neck. The leather cord slid gently through her fingers before she held the stone in her palm. The turquoise glowed softly under the winter sun, its color deep as the mountain sky after rain. She extended her hand toward Ethan. Among my people this stone carries memory, she said softly. It reminds us of the places that kept us safe when the wind was strong. Ethan looked at the pendant for a moment before shaking his head slightly. That belongs with you. Ayanna closed his hand gently around the stone anyway. Then it belongs with the man who gave me shelter when I had no name, she answered. The simple gesture carried more weight than any long speech could have. Ethan studied the pendant now resting in his palm, while the wind rolled quietly across the plains. On the distant ridge the Apache riders began to shift their horses one by one, the long line slowly turning toward the northern hills where the valley opened toward their homeland. Ayanna stepped back and turned toward the rider who had come for her. He nodded once, then mounted his horse with calm grace. The moment had arrived. Ayanna paused beside the fence and looked at Ethan one last time. When my father hears how I was treated here, she said quietly, he will remember this place. Ethan gave a small shrug, the same quiet gesture he had offered since the beginning. I did not help a chief's daughter. I helped someone who needed a warm fire. Ayanna studied him for a moment longer, then smiled with quiet understanding. Sometimes those two things are the same. She walked across the yard and mounted the waiting horse that the rider had brought for her. The animal turned smoothly toward the open valley while the winter sun stretched long shadows across the frozen ground. As Ayanna rode away toward the northern ridge, the waiting warriors slowly parted to welcome her back among them. Within minutes the entire group began moving together across the hills, their figures gradually disappearing into the wide Wyoming horizon. Ethan remained beside the corral fence watching until the last rider vanished beyond the ridge line. The wind continued moving across the empty plains, carrying the quiet sound of distant hoofbeats fading into the mountains. In his hand the turquoise pendant felt warm despite the cold air. Ethan closed his fingers around the stone and looked across the land that had brought two very different lives together for a brief moment beneath the same winter sky. And in that silence the frontier offered its own quiet truth, that sometimes the greatest changes in a man's life arrive not with noise or glory, but with a stranger knocking gently at the edge of his land.